Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Celia Maxwell. I currently serve as the Associate Dean for Research and Professor of Medicine and Infectious Diseases at Howard University. I'm pleased to welcome you to this panel discussion entitled Society's Promise for Improved Science Culture, the Societal Opportunity. I'm joined today by a distinguished panel of speakers whom I will introduce briefly. I encourage you to review their full bios on the Vivian Pinn Symposium website. They will provide opening remarks, and at the end, we will open to the general public for questions. The objectives of the workshop will include addressing the role that professional societies can play to promote the integration of sex and gender for their respective members, as well as how these societies' efforts can better serve underrepresented populations, addressing gender parity, recruitment, retention, and advancement of women in STEM. The importance of women diversity and entities that have inclusion workplace policies that highlight the need for a cultural change and paradigm shift in the scientific community to promote these changes, as well as looking again at the advancement of STEM and how it affects overall innovation. Finally, we will address some challenges and new opportunities that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused or perhaps created for diversifying the biomedical workforce, particularly for women. With that, I will start the introductions of the panelists, and they will proceed sequentially. First is Claire Kinsey. Claire is currently the National Vice President of Women and Kids Health Initiatives on the Consumer Health Team at the American Heart Association. Claire previously served as the Vice President of Communications and Public Affairs at the Cooper Institute in Dallas. Followed by Jane Van Dyes. Jane Van Dyes is an OB, hospitalist, and medical director at the Maven Clinic. She's also a co-founder of Equity Quotient and OB Best Practices in partnership with OB Project. As well, she's a co-founder of Time's Up Healthcare. Jane is a national expert and speaker on equity and healthcare. Our third speaker will be Leon McDougall. Dr. McDougall currently is the 121st President of the National Medical Association. The NMA is the largest and oldest national organization representing African American physicians and their patients in the United States. Dr. Leon McDougall was also the first African American professor with tenure in the Ohio State University Department of Family Medicine. Subsequent to Dr. McDougall, Shaheen Contractor will give her remarks. Shaheen is an environmental and social governance research analyst for Bloomberg intelligence research efforts, which includes analyzing the performance of ESG indexes and funds, among others. Last but definitely and certainly not least, is Dr. Jilda Barabino, who currently is the president of Olin College of Engineering, as well as a member of the National Academy of Engineering and the National Academy of Medicine, and the president-elect of the AAAS. This is our esteemed panel. With that, I will start with Claire. Claire is not on camera, but you will hear her do her presentation.
Yes, apologies for that, for not being able to be on camera, but Celia, thank you for the great introduction, and also thanks to the panel. It's great to be here with everyone today and really share a little bit about our work, particularly around promoting integration of sex and gender, as well as better serving underrepresented populations. You know, Celia, as you'd mentioned, my focus within the American Heart Association is really on the consumer health side for women's and kids' health. And so a little bit about the Heart Association. You know, we are the largest, oldest voluntary organization in the U.S. dedicated to fighting heart disease and stroke. We unite over 40 million volunteers in our mission. We've invested over $4.6 billion into research and funded 14 Nobel Prize winners. We are also a science-based, women-led organization by our CEO, Nancy Brown. And our organization has and continues to make significant investments and invest in advancing the health and well-being of women and diverse populations in pursuit of our mission to be a relentless force for a world of longer, healthier lives. This is critical as from the lens of our work, cardiovascular disease continues to be the leading cause of death in women, and yet women continue to be underrepresented in research, undertreated and underdiagnosed. So integral to this at the heart of our discussion today on the importance of the integration, again, of sex, gender, and equity. You know, we've long recognized the need to focus on women's health, from targeted research to improving clinical practices, systems of care, and more. For example, in 1999, the Heart Association published the first women-specific clinical recommendations for the prevention of cardiovascular disease, called Guide to Preventive Cardiology in Women, in our flagship journal, Circulation. We followed that up in 2004 with the publication of the first set of evidence-based guidelines for the prevention of cardiovascular disease in adult women. That same year, we published one of our first women's triennial studies that tracked trends and awareness over time around women understanding that cardiovascular disease is their leading cause of death. This is also the same year that Go Red for Women launched, which many of you have probably heard, and has been our flagship organization's cornerstone women's health initiative that's galvanized millions of women. In our ongoing commitment to specifically advance women's health research, we launched the Go Red for Women Strategically Focused Research Network in 2016 with the goal of fostering collaboration across research centers throughout the country to extensively study cardiovascular disease risk in women, taking into account many unique female-specific risks for heart disease and stroke, such as pregnancy, physical and emotional stress, sleep patterns, and more. As well as the AHA now has 13 peer-reviewed scientific journals, and we publish a variety of medical guidelines and scientific statements on various cardiovascular disease and stroke topics, including, as mentioned earlier, recommendations and guidelines specific to women. Just yesterday, we announced a new annual award named for a true pioneer, the Dr. Nanette K. Wenger Award for Best Scientific Publication on Cardiovascular Disease and Stroke in Women. This annual award recognizes the best manuscript focused on cardiovascular disease and stroke in women, published in one of our journals, and will be presented this year at scientific sessions in 2021. From an implementation standpoint, through Go Red for Women, we launched Research Goes Red about 2 years ago. It's a collaboration with Verily's Project Baseline that was designed specifically to engage women in the research process. It's literally an effort to put women in the driver's seat to accelerate scientific discovery, and it's a great example of citizen science in action. It's also an opportunity for us to change the narrative and perception among women on who can and should participate in research. All women have a critical role to play in advancing our understanding of the unique complexities around women's health across the lifespan. You know, the challenges imparted by COVID-19 over the last year have further exacerbated equity gaps. It's also challenged us as an organization to take bold action to advancing cardiovascular health for all. While we deepen our focus on reducing risks to women, we'll continue to approach all aspects of our work through an equity-first lens. And this can be seen even more acutely with the launch of our recent launch of our 2024 Health Equity Impact Goal, which outlines the urgent need to address health equity and quite simply states every person deserves the opportunity for a full, healthy life. Integral to this goal are 10 commitments to remove barriers to health. And just to name a few that are most relevant to today's conversation, we've committed more than $230 million in support of this work, including $100 million in new research programs and grants focused on science-based solutions to health inequities and structural racism, as well as expanding diversity research opportunities for underrepresented racial and ethnic groups in science and medicine through grant funding, STEM programs, and our HBCU and Empower to Serve Scholar programs. We also are using our extensive clinical registry programs to capture data and create new scientific knowledge on the health effects of social determinants of health. We are collaborating with our CEO Roundtable to architect a roadmap, conceptual framework, and related tools for employers to identify and dismantle practices and policies in the workplace that contribute to structural racism and health inequities. And we're also elevating the focus of our scientific journals, including Circulation and Stroke, on disparities, anti-racism, health equity, engaged community-based participatory research and implementation science. And lastly, when we look internally, we have made the commitment to increase the diversity of our own workforce, including leadership. We are committed to filling at least 1/3 of new hires with diverse individuals, mitigate any biases in recruitment, development, advancement, and retention of diverse colleagues by promoting ongoing learning and development experiences. So this year, in summary, this year has had a significant impact on all of our collective work, but for us to better serve communities, to reach gender parity, to achieve health equity, it will require commitment, investment, and collaboration across organizations. We do believe in leading by example and building powerful partnerships, as we understand the messenger is just as important as the message in bringing about sustainable change. And with that, Celia, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Claire. I would like to posit a question to you, if you'd be so kind. It seems as though there are more opportunities than ever for women to participate in scientific research. Why are there still gaps here, and what can be done to change this?
Sure. I would say from the consumer health side, I think one of the big gaps really is still the misperception or misunderstanding of who can and should participate in research. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier with Research Goes Red, launching that really was an opportunity for us to start to change the narrative that participating in research is not just for an unwell population. We need all women to be participating. So I think, communicating with clinicians, increasing the visibility of these programs, technology is allowing us to connect to people in more ways, and it's changing how we work. So I think changing that perception and really communicating the need that all women have a role to play is so critical in closing that gap.
Thank you so much, Claire. Really appreciate your answer. Next, we'll move to Jane.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to address a little bit how our professional societies, especially in obstetrics and gynecology, have transformed, and yet still so much work to do. So an event happened on social media last spring. I use Twitter. A lot of my colleagues in obstetrics and gynecology, both research and clinical, use Twitter as well. And what we saw happening was we saw a pregnancy think tank that was proposing a symposium to talk about the future of pregnancy research in the next 10 years. However, what we noticed was that this group of professionally affiliated scientists, 16 out of 17 of whom were white, and 13 out of 17 of whom were men, with only one practicing obstetrician on the panel, omitted and failed to recognize and acknowledge the profound toll that sexism, institutional racism, and structural inequities affects the output of science in obstetrics, but also on the future of those who are asking the questions, performing the research, performing the clinical studies. We noticed that there were no discussions about the impact of environmental racism on women's health, the experience of institutional access to healthcare, nutrition, adverse early life experiences. And what we did was we got together and decided to start something called the Women's Health Collaborative. And so this is an organization that obviously in 2020 we formed online. And it's a group of a lot of researchers in obstetrics and gynecology, as well as practicing clinicians, of which I am one, whose goal was really to push on our professional societies in our field in order to prevent future symposiums that just, for instance, focused on technology and didn't address how we deliver healthcare in our society and how we ask important questions about how to solve for problems in women's health. We believe that our professional societies have a duty and an obligation to resemble their demographics and their life experiences in the bodies that they represent. And so in obstetrics and gynecology, for instance, we graduate 85% women into our specialty. And yet what we see reflected in leadership is still only about 25% of obstetrics and gynecology department chairs are women. We see a lack of representation by underrepresented minorities. And so we as a field in women's health really have a lot of work to do to make sure that we do represent the constituents who are out there performing the research and practicing as well. So the same chasm that exists in gender in our professional societies exists for race and LGBTQ identifying peoples as well. And so at the collaborative, we've written editorials. I had an editorial in the December Obstetrics and Gynecology Journal about equity, along with Sarah England. And we've hosted symposiums on equity in obstetrics and gynecology. And then we have journal clubs bringing forward clinicians and researchers who might not otherwise have opportunities to share their research. So really amplifying each other's work. We try to find someone who maybe social media doesn't know is an amazing researcher and clinician in women's health and amplify their work once a week. And so our goal is really to hold our professional societies accountable and to hold each other and the departments in which we work accountable to making sure that we blind our hiring, increase quotas, support mentorship and sponsorship programs for young researchers and young clinicians, aggregating sex and gender data in the grand rounds at our respective institutions, creating even timing the amount of time that people speak at a meeting, making sure that there's equity in representation on committees and leadership within our professional societies, and really using some equity metrics to try and hold people accountable for who gets to speak, who gets funding, who gets published, and basically all the aspects of being either a clinician or a researcher in obstetrics and gynecology.
Thank you so much, Jane. A couple of questions for you. From your perspective, what do you think is needed, or what can we do to create a paradigm shift in the biomedical and scientific community to attain the goal of diversity, inclusion, and equity?
Yeah, well, I've been working in equity for 4 years now. I founded with Dr. Esther Chu our company, Equity Quotient, back in 2017. And the theme that we have noticed really is that absolutely 1,000% leadership has to be on board. It is wonderful to have push and a resistance within organizations for ideas, whether it's a symposium, whether it's a publication, whether it's a research project. But without the amplification from leadership, it's really, really hard to change some of these key metrics. And what we're talking about really are levers of power, right? So the people on committees who make decisions about hiring, the people who make decisions about promotion, the people who make decisions about publication, all of those leadership levers have to be 1,000% committed to equity. And one of the things that I've been a proponent of in order to facilitate that is really to tie compensation to equity metrics. So in the same way that we as clinicians are oftentimes measured on our patient satisfaction scores, and we have to meet a certain metric in order to get a bonus, on adverse outcomes and fulfilling CME. There's all sorts of ways in which researchers and clinicians are compelled by metrics to meet their professional obligations and goals. The same should be true for leadership when it comes to equity. Equity should be embedded into leadership executive contracts. And obviously it should not be a question as to whether or not these goals are important. They have to be important to leadership, and leadership has to share their importance out to all the members of that organization, department, or society.
Thank you so much for that, Jane. I have a follow-up question. Can you touch base on what specific organizations are investing in women's health and innovation, and what incentives could get other non-participating organizations or companies involved? Could you just address that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm involved in a couple of different organizations that are amplifying work of women and underrepresented minorities in women's health. I think again, it is a priority shift. I work with Portfolio, which is a VC fund, and we, for the most part, are looking for women founders and people, underrepresented minorities, solving problems. And so I think when you look at the amount of, for instance, capital that goes to female founders, it's much, much smaller. And especially if you look, for instance, at the amount of funding that in venture that goes to Black female founders, it's less than 1%. So we really have to change the way that we give capital, amplify each other's work. I saw on Twitter the other day, someone said, what about men who found companies in women's health? And, no one wants to take away the good work and the innovation that any person has. Having said that, there is a time to, if you are an ally, there is a time to pull up the chair, to let a woman, especially a woman of color, have that chair, amplify her work, ask her what she needs, give her money, give her capital, give her the ability to be successful, help her with networking. We know that the structure is there to support, especially, white men. How do we change some of those structural elements in order to hear other voices at the table that have not been represented, that have not gotten funding, whether grant research or whether capital? So it really is a question of changing the structures by which we amplify each other and real people resources.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that answer. Next, we'll move on to Leon.
Good afternoon, Dr. Maxwell. So I'd like to speak to our Council on Concerns of Women Physicians, otherwise known as CCWP, under the leadership of its chair, Dr. Priscilla Mpasi. And so I'll speak some of the initiatives. There are a number of them. I know I only have 5 minutes. They are doing wonderful work. So let me first start off with the Women in Healthcare Leadership Initiative. So this initiative aims to provide educational content, training, and research considerations for National Medical Association women members who desire leadership advancement, promotion, and tenure in all careers across the spectrum of medicine and healthcare organizations. And to note, with initial funding by the NIH Office on Research of Women's Health. So that partnership with NIH is existing there in January of 2020. The initiative is a longitudinal program with the first cycle to end this July of 2021 at our annual convention and scientific assembly. Now I'd like to touch on the Women Pipeline to Success program. The CCWP has reestablished its mentorship program and has expanded the program to include pre-medical and graduate students, medical students and residents and fellows. This new initiative, called the Pipeline to Success, provides scholarship opportunities, support resources, and mentorship for women underrepresented in medicine applying to medical school or residency, as well as mentorship for new resident fellow members. So how does this program support pre-medical students? Well, I'll tell you. So the pre-medical student component is a new partnership with the Association of American Medical Colleges that will provide MCAT preparation materials, and students who receive the scholarship will receive a free MCAT bundle package with full study materials, and their outcomes will be tracked longitudinally for MCAT completion. how about for medical students? So the CCWP has began a award called the Physicians Leaders on the Rise, where each NMA region will select one rising fourth year woman medical student whose involvement and activities best demonstrate the National Medical Association's mission and shows promise to be a future leader in the NMA. And last but not least, residents and fellows. The CCWP has began a new program where NMA residents and fellows are selected each year for their commitment to women's health or demonstrated potential as a woman leader in medicine. So I have, Dr. Impasi gave me a lot of information. I think I'm about at my 5 minutes, so I can keep going, but I think I'll stop there, and so we'll have appropriate time. Dr. Maxwell.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that presentation. A couple of questions for you. It sounds like this is working on what we're all concerned about, that pipeline that we need to have established for the future. How do you think programs or organizations like the pipeline program will shape the future of medicine and or healthcare leaders in future terms of diversity in the field?
So you're speaking to the important topic of mentorship and having an opportunity to work with National Medical Association physicians who are serving the Black community, who are trusted messengers in our communities. And so to connect that with the students, the learners, their parents, and with the visibility that our physicians have and the physicians and physician scientists have in the community, that's just an opportunity to leverage that leadership role to bring in a new generation of physician scientists and physicians.
Thank you so much for that. I'm sure there's going to be robust discussion from the participants on this topic, also a little later. Next, we will move on to Shaheen, Contractor, for her comments.
Thanks, Celia, and thank you to everyone for joining. As Celia mentioned, I cover ESG for Bloomberg Intelligence. So a lot of what I do is taking over the ESG data Bloomberg has. So gender metrics, for example, looking at diversity on company boards and throughout companies, taking this data and then analyzing companies on it. So what I want to discuss today and what I'd love to share is some of our analysis on how gender diversity actually impacts companies, more from a performance, more from a risk and return standpoint. So just to share a few of our outputs from the study, if we look at gender diversity, so metrics like women on boards, we find that in the US, screening out companies that trail on diversity, so those that are worse performers, they actually do improve returns. So there is this benefit from improving gender diversity on a company's underlying bottom line, which is its performance. That's in the US. What I would say, though, is what we see is that these results are a little more mixed across regions. So if you go outside the US, some countries show a benefit, some countries don't. But what I think is the really interesting part is that the results for lower volatility were a lot more definitive. So volatility is just the variability of a company's performance. A stream of returns that is a lot more stable is always more preferred, and it always leads to what we call sort of better risk-adjusted returns. And that's where integrating diversity, so picking companies that had higher percentages of women on their boards, this consistently reduced the volatility of performance. And hence we see this very direct correlation between gender being a risk mitigant, sort of protecting a company against performance falling. And that's what I think is the value add of gender diversity to a company's performance. And thanks, Celia. I'll turn it back to you. And happy to detail any of that. I know these numbers are a lot to take in.
Thank you so much, Shaheen. I have a question for you. And what are some of the ways in which we can improve the gender pay gap, the disparity that continues despite all of the advances that we may have made? What are your suggestions? What are your feelings on that topic?
You know, it's a great question. And let me start by the fact that the gender pay gap, it's a direct result of a pipeline issue. So women not being promoted up the ladder. You have too many women at the bottom of an organization earning a lower salary and too few women at the top earning a high salary. And that's what causes this gender pay gap. So what I would say is that adding and promoting women at the bottom level have a much higher impact than promoting women at the top of the ladder. In fact, we did this study using one of the indexes we have, which is our Gender Equality Index. And we found that if we reduce the number of women in the bottom pay quartile by 1%, the gender pay gap would shrink by about 0.32%. But at the same time, if you increase the women in the top quartile, the pay gap would shrink by only 0.23%. So it's very clear that increasing from the bottom has a larger impact than increasing from the top. And this is very contrary to company strategies. Most companies just seek to throw women on their boards and call themselves very diverse, but they don't seek to address this from the bottom, which is going to be the solution. So that's what I would say.
So much.
Yep, of course.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shaheen. We'll come back to that. We'll go to our next speaker, Gilda.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maxwell. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to share some work that's going on at the National Academies. Over the past several years, the Committee on Women in Science, Engineering, and Medicine of the National Academies, a committee I chair, has released several reports that bring really useful data and research to this conversation. These reports have covered topics such as addressing sexual harassment, promising practices for supporting improved recruitment, retention, and advancement of women in STEM and medical fields, intersectionality and the experiences of women of color in STEM, the science of effective mentorship, and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the careers of women in research. Now, I can't offer a summary of each of these reports in the brief time that I have with you right now, but I can highlight a few really important cross-cutting themes that appear in all of these reports. First, each of these reports drives home the important need for greater diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM and medical fields, and the opportunity cost of a homogeneous scientific enterprise. For example, we know from research described in these reports that mixed gender teams produce more influential scientific papers than single gender teams. More diverse teams generate more innovative solutions to problems, and the quality of peer review and the productivity of collaborative science increases with gender diversity as well. Second, these reports clearly document how bias, discrimination, and harassment serve as major drivers of the underrepresentation of women in STEM and medical fields, including at leadership levels, and how women from marginalized groups experience intensified, cumulative forms of bias and discrimination. Sometimes this bias and harassment is extreme and overt, but oftentimes it's happening below the waterline, to use the iceberg metaphor popularized by the Sexual Harassment Report. This everyday gender harassment has a profoundly damaging effect. And third, while these reports aim to offer guidance and tools to address these issues, these reports are not focused on fixing the women, but instead are focused on fixing the system. As such, these reports don't focus so much on driving change through modifying individual attitudes and beliefs, but more on changing a deeply biased system through policy and culture change at an organizational level. These reports emphasize that system-wide change at an organizational level will require a number of things, such as committed leadership at all levels. We need leaders engaged in setting an example and putting policies and resources in place. Required also is human and financial resources. Addressing these issues requires time, energy, and resources. Too often that we see that women, and often women of color, are asked to take on this work as an unpaid, unrecognized volunteer activity. Also required, data collection, transparency, and accountability. We need data to understand the nature of the problem and transparency and accountability to make sure we're actually making progress. Also required, an intersectional approach. Historically, efforts to support women in STEM and medicine have mostly benefited white, middle-class women at Research One institutions. These past efforts have left a lot of women out, and will also require new approaches to mentoring, teaching, and advising. We know, for example, that mentorship is one of the biggest predictors of success and retention in STEM. But we also know that to be a good mentor takes learning, and that successful mentorship must account for the identity of the mentees and for the power dynamics in mentoring relationships. And finally, we know that although the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated existing challenges and brought new challenges to the fore, it also highlighted opportunities for catalytic change. We know from our recent report on the impact of COVID-19 on the careers of women in research that women have been struggling in the pandemic with multiple issues: blurred boundaries between home and work, bearing the brunt of caregiving responsibilities, mental health challenges, and professional setbacks. But we also see new attention being paid to these issues by many institutions and leaders. So let me end these brief remarks on a positive note. Let's seize this moment and keep using data-driven approaches and symposia like this one to drive meaningful progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much. One question before we go to opening to the participants. Can you point to one particularly successful program or programs that mentor or recruit women?
Absolutely. So there are a number of programs that are detailed in the report. So I would refer everyone to those reports for sure. They get more ideas, but there's a program that's really worth highlighting, and that's the Meyerhoff report. And I'm sorry, the Meyerhoff program is a program that we would like to highlight. It's at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County, and it's received a lot of attention because it's done a lot of things that are successful, bringing cohorts together and providing a supportive climate and culture. And we have learned from that. That particular model has actually been replicated in a number of other universities. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill was one, and Penn State at University Park. And one of the things that we've noticed that's really important, it's not just what you're doing, it's the context. So the location, the environment makes a difference. So you may learn from a practice that might work really well in one context. You can learn from that, but you may need to adopt that and adapt it in ways that make sense for your own context and environment. And so the Promising Practices Report is a very good one for folks to look at for some other additional specific examples. And the last thing I'll say is that the context, again, is important, but we also need to really focus on collecting and analyzing that data so that we can track our progress and see what's making sense, what's working in one context versus another, and to address the problem that we're trying to address.
Thank you so much for that. Before we go to the questions, and there's several, I just wanted to thank Doctors McDougal, Van Dyes, Barabino, Ms. Contractor, and Kinsey for the remarks. I think it gives a lot of thought, should make us all think of the importance of the impact that we make and how we can further address the needs of these disparities, because they have impacts down the road. So to start, Dr. McDougall, participant Jennifer Harper states, as an HR professional and former board member of ATD and SHRM, I'm elated to hear about the wonderful programs underway to address underutilization of minority healthcare industry. Thanks. Do you have any comments for that? It's a word of thanks to you, but I wanted to see if you had any comments to Ms. Harper.
Well, thank you, Ms. Harper, for that comment and appreciation of the work that we're doing. I'd like to also share information about another initiative. Now, that's at my home institution at Ohio State. It's the Advocacy and Allies for Gender Equity program. And a number of times here today, people have mentioned that we don't need to fix the women, but we are going to focus on the men. And this involves convening safe space discussions with men to share promising practices for them to be more valuable allies and advocates in advancement of women careers, and also now with our newest iteration virtual platform, speaking to that intersectionality involving race and other identities. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. McDougall. Another question, actually two questions, same topic. Like Go Red for Women, isn't it a right time to go redder for women of color? And also on that same, in that same vein, shouldn't research and healthcare be going redder for women of color? And so maybe Ms. Kinsey can address.
Sure, happy to. Yeah, so Go Red for Women really has been a driving platform to unite so many women over the years. And in the past several years, we've continued to increase and deepen our focus, particularly on disparities in maternal health and how particularly Black women are disproportionately impacted. Sharing those stories, driving those important conversations is really foundational to Go Red. And kind of circling back to touch just organizationally, particularly in those 10 commitments. Again, we really are looking to use our clinical registry programs, again, to capture data, to increase our scientific knowledge on the impacts of social determinants of health. And then also we are working to create a digital learning platform for clinicians, health professionals, and scientists with courses on issues of reversing structural racism and improving health equity in the delivery of healthcare. These courses will be professional development of the science and clinical workforce. And then also kind of just tangentially in our scientific meetings as well, we will continue to push for a diversity of speakers and commentators. So, absolutely. And I think that work is underway, and we're right in the middle of
it. Thank you so much. Another question, Ms. Shamsir. There are many academic science medical research departments where there are few or even one woman in a department among a sea of men. How can they address / feel empowered to address sexual harassment? Maybe Dr. Barabino, would you like to take a stab at that one?
Sure. So I think part of the issue is like just being aware and knowing that you can use your voice and speak out, and knowing where to get the support. So many times some of the problems persist is because they don't get talked about. They get swept under the rug. There's this code of silence. And so things that we are seeing that really does make a difference is for people to know where and how they can be supported and feel that they can speak up, and to have some intentionality around creating those environments where people can do that. Also, this idea of looking at hierarchical structures and where the power dynamics create problems. So addressing those kinds of power dynamics so that people aren't in those positions where the power dynamic sort of silences women. So I think that there are opportunities to give voice, and for those to find their voice and where the support is to make a difference in these particular environments.
Thank you so much for that. A comment.
Could I add
Please.
to that also?
Go right ahead.
That's where the role of a Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion or a Chief Diversity Officer working with the leadership of the institution, looking at the data. We've mentioned data a lot too. And what I found helpful is benchmarking those departments against Association of American Medical College data. So if you have a department with one woman, and when you look nationally, however, let's say 35% or so of departments across the country are more represented. See, that's a point. That's pointing that out to the leadership, so it becomes transparent. We've used that word, so I think that's another way of helping to move the needle in such cases.
Just one other quick addition too is allyship makes such a big difference, and particularly when there's male allyship. And many places are putting in place allyship training, because even if someone doesn't have the strength to say something, an ally might have the strength to say something. And so if we have allies empowered to speak out as well, that will definitely help. And the more allies we have, and male allies in particular, the more we can make a difference.
Yeah, I will say I've likened this allyship, upstander behavior to reaching a herd immunity of equity, right, within an organization. You know, the person made the comment that what if you are the only, or what if there are only a couple of people like you in a department? How do you know that there will be accountability and transparency? Given that we've historically seen that oftentimes minoritized voices aren't believed and they're not heard. So I do think that allyship is central to equity. And I've heard, you know, we've heard that there are always going to be those in a department who push back on ideas about structural inequity. I don't see it. I don't believe the pay gap. Everyone has their equal opportunity if you just work hard enough, et cetera, et cetera. And what I say is, you know what? Our job actually isn't to probably convince everyone, because there will be those outliers. But if we reach a herd immunity of equity such that, you know, the majority of upstanders are there to say, you know, that language is not acceptable, or, you know what, you've been dominating this meeting for 45 minutes. Let's give someone else a chance to speak. We need those upstanders to create that herd immunity so that everyone feels inclusive, even if they are an only.
Thank you so much for those comments. A couple of comments. Dear Dr. Van Dyes, I would also like to recommend that you add a patient advocate's color to your initiative. Or input can be very valuable to support your efforts. We need a cure for lupus. This is Lupus Awareness Month. Any comments on that, Dr. Van Dyes?
Yeah, I think patient advocacy groups are essential to addressing equity. We in obstetrics and gynecology do have a history of historic racism and sexism. So very much an acknowledgement of the fact that many have experienced trauma in healthcare. So those who are here to heal have actually harmed. And I do think that that's where patient advocacy organizations can be essential to giving a voice to how our structural racism has really affected, especially women of color, but even within obstetrics and gynecology, a field dedicated to women, there is misogyny within our field. So we sometimes absolutely need to partner with patient advocacy organizations to understand how we have harmed and how we're going to change our practices going forward so that we are here to heal.
Thank you so much for that. I would like to give all the panelists 30 seconds to say a final remarks so that we can conclude this very enlightening session. I'll start with Dr. Barabino.
Sure, thank you. Like one of the things I like to say for people to remember is don't underestimate the power of the power of what an individual could do to make a difference. And think about the person who we're honoring today, Dr. Vivian Pinn. Her leadership, her steadfastness, her advocacy has created this office for research on women's health. And there's so many other things that we can look to. So the power of staying true to those convictions can really make a difference. So I really wanted to, get that point out there as well.
Thank you. Ms. Kinsey?
Absolutely. I would say I'd echo the previous sentiments and say this is such an important conversation for us to continue to have, and having diversity of thought and diversity and representation is critical to advancing our understanding and really kind of bringing again about that sustainable change. We tend to say we need more women, particularly more diverse women, creating solutions for women. And, my hope is that we continue along this path. This has been a really terrific panel discussion today.
Thank you so much. Dr. McDougall?
Yes, also like to thank Dr. Pinn for her leadership, and go back to the topic, the theme for this session, culture, right? It's the culture. For example, in science labs, basic science labs, do we have a culture that will support people who go on parental leave? That's a big issue. Will there be bridge funding available to support the research team? So creating a culture where that intersectionality can be addressed and everyone can thrive.
Thank you so much, Dr. McDougall. Ms. Contractor?
Thanks, Celia. I would echo what everyone said about the importance of this topic and just reinforce that the impacts of gender diversity are seen also on a company's bottom line. And that, I think, just drives this entire point home. So I would just remind everyone about just the importance of doing this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Van Dys.
Yes, I plus one everything everyone has said, and really appreciate the work of Dr. Pinn. My closing comment would just be that you can't change what you don't measure. A lot of our speakers here today have talked about the importance of measurement of data and metrics. We hold our leaders and we hold our societies and our departments accountable through measurement and through metrics. And, as much as we can objectify the data and really push ourselves and our societies and leaders to Dr. McDougall's point, to change that culture, that's really going to have, I think, the most profound effect.
Thank you so much. Just to wrap up, I thank you for all your comments. I certainly have learned a lot. I've learned a lot from Dr. Pinn, who was at Howard many, many years ago. I've always admired her and followed her wherever she went. And I think this symposium and our participation in this workshop is a fitting measure of our appreciation for what she has trailblazed, really, for women in the biomedical sciences, and I know certainly will serve as large shoes to fill for many of the women that will follow us. So with that, I would like to say thank you again to my colleagues, panel members, presenters. Your hard work made this possible. I thank Jamie for her guidance, forbearance, and patience with all of us, and I wish you all a great, great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.